When people talk about legends of American cinema, the name Robert Redford almost always comes up. For decades, he represented a certain kind of quiet strength on screen, calm, thoughtful, and deeply expressive. But behind that composed image was a life shaped not just by success, but by loss, resilience, and deeply personal relationships that rarely made headlines. Long before fame found him, Redford's life was far from glamorous. Growing up in Santa Monica, he was known more for his restless energy than for any clear ambition. He struggled with direction in his early years, often torn between creativity and rebellion. School didn't hold his attention for long, and his path forward seemed uncertain. In his youth, he drifted, traveling, experimenting with art, and searching for meaning. Those years weren't wasted, though. They quietly shaped the sensitivity and depth that would later define his performances. But at the time, he was simply a young man trying to figure out who he was. Everything began to shift when he met Lola Van Wagenen. She brought something into his life that he lacked: stability. Where he was impulsive, she was grounded. Their connection was immediate, and despite coming from very different worlds, they saw something in each other that felt worth holding onto. Their decision to marry came quickly and not without resistance. They were young, financially unstable, and stepping into an uncertain future. But what they lacked in security, they made up for in belief in each other and in the life they hoped to build together. The early years of their marriage were defined by struggle. Redford was still trying to establish himself as an actor, taking whatever work he could find. Money was tight and success felt distant. Through it all, Lola remained a steady presence, managing their home and encouraging him to keep going when doubt crept in. Then came a moment that changed everything: the birth of their first child. For Redford, becoming a father brought a new sense of purpose. It grounded him in a way nothing else had before. But that happiness was heartbreakingly short-lived. Their son passed away as an infant, a loss that would stay with them forever. At the time, there were few answers and even fewer ways to process such grief. For Redford, it was a turning point, one that brought deep emotional weight into his life. In the aftermath, he struggled. The grief was overwhelming, and like many parents in that situation, he questioned everything. But during that time, Lola became the emotional anchor. While she carried her own pain, she helped hold their world together, quietly guiding them forward. Over time, they rebuilt. Their family grew, and life slowly regained a sense of rhythm. But the loss never truly disappeared. It became part of who they were. For Redford, it added a depth that would later be visible in his work. As his career finally began to rise, the world started to see what Lola had always believed. His performances carried a quiet intensity that set him apart. Films like Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid turned him into a global star, especially alongside Paul Newman. But success came at a cost. The demands of Hollywood pulled him further away from home. Long shoots, travel, and constant public attention created distance in his personal life, distance that slowly became difficult to ignore. Despite their shared history, their marriage began to change. The connection that once felt unbreakable was now under pressure from a completely different life than the one they had started together. Eventually, they made the difficult decision to part ways. What stood out, however, was how they handled it. There was no public bitterness, no dramatic fallout. Instead, there was respect, something Redford would continue to express for Lola throughout his life. He never forgot the role she played during his most difficult years. Later in life, Redford found a different kind of companionship with Sybil Shaggers. Their connection was quieter, rooted in shared values like art, nature, and environmental work. It wasn't about fame, it was about understanding. Together, they built a life centered around Sundance Institute and the creative community it supported. For Redford, Sundance became more than a place; it became a reflection of everything he believed in. In his later years, he stepped away from the spotlight, choosing instead a quieter life surrounded by nature. But even then, the past stayed with him: the love, the loss, and the people who shaped his journey. And perhaps that's what defines his story most. Not just the films or the fame, but the relationships, the ones that held him together when everything else felt uncertain. As time moved forward, Robert Redford began to slow down, not out of necessity but by choice. After decades in the spotlight, he had reached a point where recognition no longer defined him. What mattered now was meaning. He gradually stepped away from the relentless rhythm of Hollywood and turned his attention toward something more lasting. That something was Sundance, a place that had quietly grown alongside his career. What started as a personal escape evolved into a cultural landmark. Through the Sundance Institute and the globally recognized Sundance Film Festival, Redford created opportunities for storytellers who might never have been heard otherwise. But Sundance was never just about film. For Redford, it represented a philosophy, a belief that art, nature, and human connection should exist in balance. Away from red carpets and cameras, he found peace in the mountains where the noise of fame could no longer reach him. Still, even in that calm environment, life continued to test him. One of the most difficult chapters came with the illness of his son, James Redford. Watching a child face a long health struggle is something no parent is prepared for, no matter how strong they appear from the outside. James fought his illness with remarkable courage, eventually becoming a filmmaker and environmental advocate in his own right. For Redford, this was a source of both pride and heartbreak. He saw in his son the same passion for storytelling, but also the quiet resilience that had defined his own life. When James passed away, it marked another profound loss. For someone who had already experienced the death of a child early in life, the grief returned with a familiar weight. But this time, it came with decades of reflection and a deeper understanding of how fragile life can be. Through these moments, the presence of Sybil Shaggers remained steady. Their relationship was not built on the intensity of youth but on something quieter: mutual respect, shared values, and emotional understanding. She didn't try to fill the spaces left by the past, instead she helped him live with them. Together, they focused on projects that extended beyond personal success. Environmental advocacy, artistic collaborations, and cultural initiatives became central to their lives. Their work reflected a shared belief that creativity should serve a purpose greater than recognition. Unlike the early years of his career, Redford no longer needed to prove anything. The urgency had faded, replaced by intention. He chose projects carefully, often stepping behind the camera rather than in front of it, allowing new voices to take center stage. Despite his global recognition, he remained a deeply private person. Interviews became rare, and when he did speak, it was often with reflection rather than promotion. He talked less about fame and more about legacy, about what remains when the spotlight fades. In those quieter conversations, one theme appeared again and again: gratitude, not just for success but for survival. For the people who stood beside him during his lowest moments, especially Lola Van Wagenen, whose influence he never denied even decades after their separation. He understood something that many in Hollywood never fully grasp: that success alone doesn't sustain a life. It's the relationships, the hardships, and the moments of quiet support that shape who a person truly becomes. As he aged, Redford seemed less like a distant Hollywood icon and more like a storyteller reflecting on his own journey. The roles he once played on screen, complex, thoughtful, often carrying hidden pain, now felt closer to his real self than ever before. There was no dramatic farewell, no grand final act. Instead, his later years unfolded with quiet dignity. He remained connected to the things that mattered most: family, creativity, and the natural world that had always grounded him. And in the end, perhaps that's the most honest way to understand his life. Not as a series of achievements, but as a story of endurance, of a man who faced loss, embraced change, and continued forward with a sense of purpose. Because behind the fame, behind the films, and behind the image that millions admired was someone who lived through the same complexities as anyone else: love, grief, doubt, and hope. And that is what makes the story of Robert Redford not just a Hollywood narrative, but a deeply human one.
Yes,